This is Performance Anxiety on the Pantheon Podcast Network, and I am your host, Mark. And as the episode title says, this episode is all about the band Genesis. My brother Scott has written 2 in-depth articles about the band's early years for the Strange Brew blog. Both he and longtime podcast friend Jordon Zadorozny of Blinker the Star joined me to discuss the history of Genesis, from Peter Gabriel all the way through Ray Wilson. Check out Scott's work at scottsheaauthor.com. Check out Jordan's music at blinkerthestar.bandcamp.com. Follow them on socials at scottsheaauthor and at Blinker the Star. Follow us at Performance ANX. Our merch is available at performanceanx.threadless.com, and you can support us with caffeine at ko-fi.com/performanceanxiety. And without further ado, Scott Shea and Jordon Zadorozny on the history of Genesis on Performance Anxiety on the Pantheon Podcast Network. That's the goal for this podcast, and if we can do it in an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, I think that'd be ideal.
Yeah, well, that's about the length of a Genesis song
in
that
era. Very true. Very true. So let's just jump into it. And the reason we're talking about this is because, Scott, you've written an article in Strange Brew about the early days of Genesis. It's the band's inception all the way. The first article is all the way through 1970, and then the second article, I'm assuming we'll cover from 70
it'll go up till 71, and it'll just really get up. The point of the article is to how the classic 5-man lineup from the 70s, came with the addition of Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, because the way those two joined is a pretty incredible story in itself. So,
cool.
So just kind of it's an area of Genesis that's always a little bit overshadowed. I think it's a little shrouded in darkness because it's weird because Genesis started really, for all intents and purposes, in 1966, December 1966. But they started as 2 separate songwriting teams that just kind of joined together. And there's Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks. And then there was Mike Rutherford and Anthony Phillips. They all went to this elite boarding school called Charterhouse, which is weird. In England, it's called public school, but it's private school. So I don't understand, that, but the school had been around since about the 1600s. It's where the British elite sent their boys to become officers and gentlemen. It's where football, or as we call it, soccer, was allegedly invented. And it's where Richard Gere met Louis Gossett Jr. for the first time. Yeah, was it? That's a pretty bad joke, but it's needless to say, Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks all came from wealth and privilege, and they came together to form this. And like I said, they came together as 2 separate songwriting teams who just so happened to make an album together with this guy named Jonathan King, who was he was a singer. He had a hit with Everyone's Gone to the Moon in 1965. He was from Charterhouse too. He was an alumnus. Okay. And he came back. He's what they called an old Carthusian, which was just a name for an alumnus. I guess Carthusian is a takeoff of Charterhouse, So they got a friend of theirs to pitch Jonathan this demo, and he liked it. He liked Peter Gabriel's voice particularly, and he just got behind them after a while. He was kind of here and there and all over the place, but he eventually got put his focus on the group and got him a record deal, with Decca, which is no small potatoes. I mean, Decca had the Rolling Stones, they had the Moody Blues, they had a lot of groups in England recorded on Decca. They infamously turned down the Beatles, right? So they got a deal with them and recorded this record. And it wasn't until after the record got released and flopped that they decided, hey, let's become a band. So that's the early history of Genesis. They're very early. And it's a little shrouded in darkness. And when they started playing live and what their repertoire was, it was mostly originals. It was mostly songs off of the album with and early versions of songs that like The Knife and Looking for Someone and others that would become part of their second album. And also some covers too, mostly British blues covers. They did some Albert King. They did some Cream,
Wow.
which was de rigueur, for the
I would
time.
love to hear Peter Gabriel do a cover of Cream.
Well, Peter Gabriel was very influenced by like Otis Redding and Marvin Gaye, So I bet you he could probably do it pretty reasonably well.
Oh yeah, I just think it would sound awesome because his voice is so unique. It's just
it is.
That would be really wild. So we'll jump in and out of the timeline here as we go. So let's give a little bit of personality to this here. So I remember the very first time I remember ever hearing Genesis was my mom had taken Scott and I out to I don't know, she was shopping or something, and I think we ended up in like a Kmart type of store. I don't remember exactly what it was, and she was like, "All right, you guys have been really good. You can go buy a record." And we ended up with this K-Tel record, Hit Express. And it was freaking amazing. It had Van Halen doing Pretty Woman on it. It had Huey Lewis and the News doing Do You Believe in
Foreigner.
Love? It had Foreigner on it. It had Hall & Oates, Did It in a Minute.
Right.
It also had Genesis, Abacab on it.
And Phil Collins. It had In the Air Tonight.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it had, Phil was on there twice, which is ridiculous. So that's the song that really, and I think Abacab actually kicked off the album, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And so that was the very first exposure I had to Genesis. And I thought, like, what is this weird song? But, I'm like under 10 years old, I think, at that point. So I'm like, I'm not going to go out and start looking up Genesis. And I'm assuming for Scott, that's the first time you remember hearing Genesis as well.
Yeah, I loved it. And then also around the same time, they were killing it on the top 40, and their videos were all over the place on MTV. And then you had Phil Collins at the same time, and then eventually Mike and the Mechanics, and then Peter Gabriel. Like, I didn't even know at that time that Peter Gabriel had been part of Genesis.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of artists, I say, rule the 80s. You could put Springsteen in there. You could put Madonna, Michael Jackson, Prince, Hall & Oates. But the Genesis is right in there, too.
Oh, yeah.
Between them, Phil Collins, Pete Gabriel, and Mike and the Mechanics, they were everywhere from like 1980 to 88, 89.
Yeah. So, Jordan, what's your first Genesis memory? When did they first strike a chord with you?
Well, not long after you. It would have been my sort of pop music awakening was 1983, and so the self-titled album was out then.
Yeah.
And so it would have been That's All. Illegal Alien was on Much Music Up Here, was our sort of answer to MTV. So it would have been those things and Mama, and then Phil was starting to. He had a second solo album, which I remember hearing at the time. And then that kind of dovetailed into my friendship with my lifelong pal, Doug Hempstead. So we started really becoming fast friends. And he, unlike me, he had older brothers. So we'd go over to his place, and there was all of the early Genesis albums, these albums.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
So I got to hear those things, maybe not quite understand them, and realized that there was this other singer before, and his name was Peter Gabriel. Oh, he has these weird sort of new wave solo albums that his older brothers also had.
Yeah.
And sort of kind of worked my way through it. And then, by 1986, all, as you said, Genesis, Peter Gabriel, and Phil Collins, and then Mike and the Mechanics were having humongous chart mainstream pop success. So by then, of course, there was, it was everywhere. You couldn't avoid them at all.
And Tony Banks was the only one left out in the cold as far as solo albums.
Well, he made kind of quizzical, cool, quizzical, like almost soundtrack albums. I have all of I have the Tony Banks solo albums and the Mike Rutherford ones, which I like quite a bit, especially the first one.
acting very
But
strange.
we digress. Anyway, in the 80s, they were everywhere. And in the early 70s, that as Scott's article was saying, it's like their foundations are kind of shaky, unlike Led Zeppelin, who showed up in a rehearsal space and everyone agreed, bam, there it was, it just instantly happened. But with Genesis, there's all these sort of strange pieces coming together, and that's kind of where we're at now. It's like, and that first album, to anyone who, I think that's the album people almost listen to last when they're getting into Genesis, because it certainly sounds the least like what most people imagine Genesis to sound like.
Yeah, for sure. And it's the last album they listen to, and they judge it through the eyes of what they've heard Genesis became, so it's really not fair.
Right. Not at all. No, and it's a pretty charming record. And then I was reading your article about how I think the horns and strings might have come after and was maybe not their decision.
No, I think Jonathan King was kind of going for a Moody Blues sound, but the Moody Blues recorded with their strings, and it was such a cut and paste job. And I like strings. There's a lot of people out there that just hate strings and they think it diminishes. I love strings when they're used well. Listen to any early Drifters record or Roy Orbison or something like that. The strings are used so effectively and beautifully. And even with the Moody Blues and the Beatles used them a few times to great effect, but like this was just, there's a few times where it's okay, it's not so bad, but it's just like, they sounded like they were nowhere near when these strings were added, and it's just like, and Anthony Phillips, he's just to this day, he's a little less harsh on that album, but he's like, I can't listen to it. It's like, it reminds me of Billy Joel when he first heard his record and they had sped his Cold Spring Harbor. They sped his vocal out by like a half speed, and he took the record off the turntable and went outside and chucked it down the street. It's like wanted nothing to do with it. So
that caused him to go into exile for a few years.
Yeah, for sure. That's what bad production will do.
All right, so that first album is not what they wanted it to be. I think we can all agree on that, but Trespass is closer to what they started to become when they had their own creative control. Do you think if they had done From Genesis to Revelation on their own, it would have been a little bit more proggy, or is that something that came later? And I don't know who wants to answer that one. Honestly, you guys could just jump in on that one.
Well, if you want me to go, I can kick it off. Yeah, Trespass. Well, it's hard to say because I don't know if they had, it just wasn't in the cards in those days to just hand the reins over to a bunch of 17, 18-year-old kids. Right. And say, here, have at it. Spend as much money in the studio as you want. And it was really at Jonathan King. They bash him a lot, and he's certainly become a nefarious character, over the years, but he really hustled for them. He put out 2 singles that flopped, went absolutely nowhere, and then he convinced Decca to release an album on them. So it's like, and it really took them in and nurtured them through that process. They rented the Regent Sound studio for like a week, and they finished it in 3 days. So wow. So I don't know that if they had done it on their own, it might have been that minus the strings, right? Okay. So, and a lot of those versions are available. And some of the songs that appeared on Trespass were written around that time. Visions of Angels was actually recorded From Genesis to Revelation.
I see her face and run to take her hand. Why she's never there, I just don't understand. The trumpet sound, my whole world crumbles down. Visions of angels on around, dance in the sky, leaving me here.
And like every early Genesis track that was recorded, it somehow disappeared. Nobody knows where it is. There's like dozens of these tracks that they fell by the wayside. Gosh. Which, if somebody finds them, it's a gold mine. Oh, yeah. But I think through that, they were starting to get influenced. Everybody was influenced by King Crimson back then. everybody, that went into prog. Any prog group, they were influenced by King Crimson and the Nice. Those were two of the biggest groups, and they listened to those two, and especially the Nice, because the Nice came first. And there was a song called Rondo, which is, when you listen to it, it's just an instrumental. It's like 8 minutes long, but it sounds just like the Knife. So they took Rondo and changed the tune up a little bit and added lyrics to it. And so, they just kind of, I think the negative experience of the release of From Genesis to Revelation really helped them to develop their own sound and what they wanted to do. Because Jonathan King was very much into pop. He was very much into the Bee Gees at the time. He wanted hit records, and that's not what they wanted to do. They wanted to sound like King Crimson and the Nice, and Yes was starting to come out and be pretty influential around that same time. So and they were right there in the heart of it in London, right outside London. They would go and see these clubs, these clubs and see these groups. So was Phil Collins, and so was Steve Hackett, at the same time. So I think without the failure of Genesis to Revelation, we probably wouldn't have them moving on. Because if they had succeeded with From Genesis to Revelation, they probably would have been like a Bee Gees knockoff band.
Yeah.
They would have had to write pop songs like The Silent Sun, which is a nice song.
The silent sun that never shines. She is the warmth of my lonely heart. The motion of a turning wheel. Can't you stop it and look around? Baby, you feel so close.
I like it, but it's not what I'm glad they failed, because it gave us what came with Trespass and then Nursery Crime and the other albums.
Feels as if Trespass is like where, as you say, they kind of decided to be a band, and the songs sound like they were rehearsed as a band as opposed to sort of constructed in the studio quickly. And it sounds well rehearsed, of course, like, we're listening in retrospect, and we know that Nursery Crime's coming next, which is, such a, for me, it really it becomes cohesive with Phil and Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it becomes a lot more confident and aggressive. I find on Nursery Crime, you can hear this immediate in 3 or 4 of the tracks, but it's much more, they're sort of drifting away from the purely pastoral, and it's there's a bit of a edge to it,
Yeah.
with the guitars and the rhythm section.
Yeah, that's the benefit of having a guy like Phil Collins come in and sit. You have a great drummer. It's like having a great catcher on a baseball team or a great center.
Yeah.
It's gonna magnify what you do and just set a good rhythm section. They already had a good bassist in Mike Rutherford, and Jordon, you nailed it too. I mean, the songs from Trespass, they were worked out over a longer period of time. They had 6 months to a year to develop those songs, and they went in to the Trespass sessions just ready to bang them out. And with Nursery Crime, it was different. They wrote some of those songs like Musical Box had some elements that had already been written before, but they mostly wrote those as they were getting ready for the sessions and actually in the sessions.
Right, and that sort of became the fashion at the time, certainly for the progressive rock bands, like a lot of the composition and certainly the editing of the compositions, like with Yes, particularly on like Fragile and Close to the Edge, where I'd read stories where they'd come up with a part that would last for maybe two minutes long or something, and they'd stop the tape. And then they'd sit around and scratch their beards and say, okay, what do we write? And they would write another part to that, and then sort of just attach it, with tape splicing and stuff like that. And I love that. I love that when the writing in the studio starts to creep in, things start to get a little saucy and a little, more interesting. The arrangements get a little more tricky, I find.
Yeah, for sure.
So the band is go together. It's the original four guys. So Tony Banks, Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, and Anthony Phillips, all up through Trespass. Are they?
Right.
Do you guys know? Are they playing a lot of shows out live, or are they kind of staying close to home? I don't know too much of their touring history.
I mean, it's mostly London centric. You know, they got a gig at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club. It was called Upstairs at Ronnie's. There was like the downstairs floor, which was kind of more popular stuff, and then upstairs was like where all the prog rocks with, you know, Van der Graaf Generator and Lindisfarne and these other groups would go up and play. You know, Curved Air. You know, these groups like that. Gentle Giant. You know, and you know, they're gigging around, and it's funny because before they got signed with Tony Stratton Smith, who became their manager, and you know, he owned Charisma Records. It was Peter Gabriel who was he was the promoter for him, and he was doing the hustling for him and getting them signed to these gigs. They would play a lot at universities, you know, pubs, and they played in just weird places, man. There's an infamous, I wrote about it in the article where they played to a crowd of one, you know, and Peter Gabriel's like, after a while, he's like, anybody, you got any requests? Yeah. You know? so
I've had a lot of people on for the podcast who've had a similar experience. I played with the bartender.
So it's you know, and it was just good, and but you know, I think that helped them. And you know, it developed as a really good live act. You know, and they had their bumps and bruises. Their very first gig, they didn't even know how to set up. You know, they're putting the 12-string, you know, right next to the amp, and it's causing feedback, and it was a nightmare. But it was fortunately for them, and where the places they were playing, it was trial and error. And, you know, eventually they build up to where they're playing at the Lyceum Theater, you know, and they get, you know, when they got Phil and everybody. So it was a good set. But then, you know, right after they finished the sessions is when Anthony Phillips quit.
Yeah. Why? So why did he quit?
You know, he was a sickly guy. He was sick a lot. You know, in school, I know he had mononucleosis, which he called glandular fever. I asked my wife. My wife said RN. I said, "What's glandular fever?" She's like, "I don't know." She's like, "I've never heard that." She knows everything. Yeah. So she looks it up. She's like, "Oh, it's mononucleosis." You know, so it's like, "Oh, okay."
Well, it's like public school being private school. You know, it
is.
Means something else.
Yeah, they have weird terms over there. You know, it's like they have some some dish there. It's called like meat something, and it's mince meats, and it's like food. It's not. It's like
a dessert. Fruits and stuff.
Yeah, it's like mince meats. I don't understand. You know, so but he was very sickly, and he developed like a case of stage fright. I think the moment was getting too big for him. I think he saw that this band was headed in one direction, and he hated touring. You know, we saw this, like, I wrote an article about Chad Allen, the founder of the Guess Who, last year, and it was the same thing with him. He left. He saw the band was getting huge, and he couldn't handle that. He didn't like the touring life. He wasn't, you know, some guys just aren't built for that. And I'm sure, Jordan, you know, you've probably met tons of guys like that along the way.
Yeah. Our first bass player was that. I mean, we went on one, you know, a couple medium-sized tours in the States, and he was just like, man, this is not.
Yeah.
See, you guys needed an audience of one, which I gotta say, an audience of one is
New Haven, Connecticut.
Yeah, I honestly, I think an audience of one is going to be just as awkward for that one guy in the audience as it is for the band.
0 is infinitely better than 1.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Scott, in the beginning, you said that there was a really wild story about how they ended up getting Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, and this is about the time when that happened, right? About just after Trespass, around 1970. So, how did they recruit them?
Well, when Anthony left, they decided to sack their drummer. They were on their third drummer. They're like Spinal Tap when it came to drummers, except, you know, they didn't spontaneously explode. They just, like, their first drummer was
fired.
Fire was involved, but it wasn't that kind. So the first drummer, Chris Stewart, was a fellow Carthusian. He was a Charterhouse student, and he just wasn't really. He played on the single sessions, the Silent Sun, and he just, you know, Jonathan King's just like, he's terrible. We got to fire him. So they fired him. And their second one was another kid their age. You know, in England, when you go from like public school or whatever their equivalent of high school is, and you go to college, you got to take what they call the A levels. It's like, I guess it's like SATs, you know.
Okay.
And so Pete was studying for his A levels at this one school, and he met a guy named John Silver, who was a drummer, and they were looking for a drummer, so they invited him in, and he played on the album. And I guess he was okay, but after the album failed, they weren't sure what they were going to do. Things were kind of up in the air for 6 months or so. And John got accepted to Cornell University in the United States, up in Ithaca, New York. So he decided to go there. And and Peter Gabriel's like, well, if we decide to go on, we'll call you. And he went to Cornell and waited for the phone call that never came. And they decided to go on, but they got this guy named John Mayhew. He was their third drummer, and he had some gigging experience. He had played in a couple bands that played live around London, and they gave him a shot. He was one of these guys who's passing around his number to everybody. Say, hey, I'm a drummer if you need me. And then somehow Mike Rutherford ended up with him. They talked on the phone. He came and auditioned, and they liked him. But his drumming was a little bit sloppy, a little bit heavy-handed at times. You can hear on Trespass. And when Anthony left, Tony Banks was just like, well, let's fire John because he's not good.
Why not?
And he I don't, like I said, his playing was a little bit heavy-handed where it needed to be a little softer. Back then they were like really into the soft like 12-string acoustic sound, so they needed a drummer who could match that nicely, and he just wasn't that guy. And they wanted everybody to be a collaborator. They wanted everybody to be involved in the process of making songs. And John just wasn't into that. Like, they would have to tell him, this is how we want you to play it. Oh, okay. And when he'd do it, he would do it well. Yeah. But he would never be like, hey, what if you do something like this? What if I do a rat-a-tat-tat here or something, or I don't know drum terms, but
some kind of drum fill.
Yeah, do a fill here, do that, so do a press roll there or something, so he would never do that. So it just kind of got to a point of annoyance. So they fired him, and they held an audition. And they put a big ad in the back of Melody Maker, a big square ad that really stuck out. I've seen the actual classified section with the ad in it, and it's the only one that's boxed, and it says Tony Stratton Smith. And anybody who's a musician in London, and they knew who Tony Stratton Smith was, and they knew this was a big band that was looking for somebody. And so so Phil knew Tony because Phil had played in a group called Flaming Youth, and he'd met Tony a few different times. So, and he knew that Tony was a drinker at the Marquee Club, so he went and tracked him down. Like the ad posted on August 1st, I think, like maybe that which was a Saturday, and that Sunday night he goes to see Tony just to see if he can get an in, because Flaming Youth just broke up, and he wants to play live, and he can't. He's trying to find a group that'll let him play live more. And he was a really good drummer. He played on the George Harrison session, at that time. Okay. And his name was getting out there. He was a childhood actor. He had been in some movies. And
Hard Day's Night.
So
yeah, Hard Day's Night. Yeah.
Yeah, Hard Day's Night. Calamity the Cow.
Calamity the Cow.
Yeah, he had a starring role in that. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
He was the cow.
Yeah, so.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
So anyway, Tony's like, no, these guys are really picky. You're going to have to call them and do an audition. So he calls and he talks with Peter, and they get an audition, and he goes down there like the next day, like August 3rd. And it's interesting. They're out in a town called Chobham, which is in Surrey, which is about 40 minutes to the east, it's to the southwest of London. And so he and his friend, his fellow Flaming Youth guitarist, who was his friend, Ronnie Carroll, who played, they were looking for a drummer and a 12-string guitarist. So they drove out there and they set up the audition, and both had auditioned for him. And Phil was in the back of the line for drummers. There was about 15 drummers there trying out. So it was a nice big house. Peter Gabriel's parents were loaded, right? So they go through. They take him out to the terrace. His mom's like, "You can, if you want to take a dip in the pool, you can. It's a heated pool." So Phil had this like real YOLO attitude. So he's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna take a dip in the pool." So he's swimming and he's listening to all the other drummers try out, and he's hearing where they're making mistakes. And Phil, as we know now, Phil is like an incredible drummer. He's just soaking it all up. He's soaking up their mistakes. He's soaking up everything they're doing right. He can tell that they're put off. They give every drummer, if you want to warm up, do you want to warm up? And they'd be like, yeah. And they would go into drum solos. And he could just tell by looks on their faces that they were put off by that. Genesis is not a jam band. They're not a drum solo band. They go up, they play the song as it's written in their live performance. They never really deviate from it too much. Mike Rutherford was never a guitar shredder. His crotch wasn't out in front, dangling. He's trying to impress him. So he was. They were put off by that. So he's like. So when Phil sat down, they're like, "Do you want to do a drums? Do you want to warm up?" And Phil's like, "No, I'll just get right into it." And Peter had played everybody like 3 songs off the album Trespass, which hadn't even been released yet. So they're playing The Knife. They're playing Looking for Someone. They're playing Stagnation. And Phil just rocked it. He just, with him being a natural the way he was, and to be able to spy and listen on everybody, he gave him a real leg up. And they called him the next day. They said, "We want you. The job's yours if you want it."
Wow.
And he was real cool about it. And it's funny because I was able to obtain a list for my article of other drummers who tried out, which I'd never seen before. It was actually in a book that came out in 1980. But I haven't, I was able to track it down, and I was able to get some of the names that I recognize. Most of them were no names, but there's a few guys. There's a guy who played for a group called the Ivy League, which I'm aware of them. There's a guy who played for Junior's Eyes, which Junior's Eyes backed up David Bowie on a BBC session with Tony Visconti. There was a guy from the Downliners sect, which was a kind of a Animals-ish, kind of Pretty Things style group. Yep. In the mid '60s. So it's kind of neat to see that, and that'll be in my follow-up article. So he was in some. I think there was a lot of guys names I couldn't find anywhere. I didn't know, and I never saw them. There was a guy who's from a group called Pegasus, which I couldn't even find the group Pegasus. It's like, I don't even know if they probably didn't even record anything, but so he wanted out. And the funny thing was they didn't pick, none of the guitarists there really impressed them. And the 12-string is a complicated instrument, it's complicated in its tuning. You can't play it like you play a 6-string guitar. And I think, Ronnie Carroll was just like, yeah, I'm just going to go study the 12-string real quick so I can go, audition for Genesis, whereas Mike Rutherford, he had mastered the 12-string by then, and I don't think there was, in that time in England, there was a lot of guys playing the 12-string guitar. I think that was something that developed over time. That was more of an American thing. That was like the Byrds were doing that, Roger McGuinn. Yeah. And a lot of guys were getting it was bigger over here first, but then it became an incredible tool for the prog rock movement. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it was a big ask for a guy their age, because they're 19, 20, to have somebody there around their age to play the 12-string. So they went through a couple guys temporarily, and then they saw Steve Hackett placed an ad in Melody Maker, and it's worded very strangely, like about stagnant. I'm looking to play with a band who's not up to playing stagnant music forms. Mark knows because he interviewed Steve Hackett.
I think Steve actually read the ad in my podcast, if I remember correctly.
Right. He's probably got it memorized. He's probably been asked about that ad 10,000 times. But it caught Peter Gabriel's attention. So, and they called him up, and like Steve, like talked him into coming to his house. Like he didn't go to audition for him. I think he auditioned for him at another point. But the first meeting was like, because Steve had played in a couple bands, but he had zero live experience. He had never played live at that point in his life. He played with a group called The Quiet World. It was a studio concoction. They put out an album just called Quiet World, which was like, it was about the gospel. It was supposed to be the story of Jesus Christ, but I don't know. I do have the album. I haven't listened to it in years. I don't know if I remember it not really jumping out at me.
Yeah.
So he had very limited experience, but he really impressed him. And like at their very first audition together, he and Phil and Tony Banks were really, really jiving. Steve's like, well, what if we try this? Which that's important because they had a guy for a very short time named Mick Barnard, who was kind of like John Mayhew. You just got to have, he was a good player. He could play well, but he had to be told what to do. Yeah. He was too shy or just not interested in collaborating or offering, any ideas how we can improve on this arrangement. He did come up with something that they eventually used in Musical Box at the end. That he came up with that. But that was that's at the end of the song. It's very effective. It's like the big crescendo, right? Where Peter Gabriel's not on the stage shaking his tambourine, and but that was the only thing he really contributed to it. So he didn't get the job for the same reason they fired John Mayhew, and then because they also had met Steve Hackett, and Steve just kind of blew him away. So a long answer to your question of how they. Got those.
It's amazing how some of these bands come together, and it is especially when the band evolves the way Genesis has, and it doesn't start off with the same people it ends up with in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. So this era, the Peter Gabriel era, it's known for big overblown songs, 10-minute songs, songs that are like an entire side of an album, Musical Box,
Supper's Ready.
So, yeah, exactly. Supper's Ready. Yeah. But for me, I love, and maybe it's just because I'm getting older, and some of these 20-minute songs, I'm just like, I just don't have time for this. I could die before this song ends. So, but my favorite Peter Gabriel song from the Peter Gabriel Genesis era is Carpet Crawlers. To me, that is the best Genesis song of that era.
Leaving their free carpet crawlers, heed their crawlers. We've gotta get in to get out. We've gotta get in to get out. We gotta get in to get out. Mild man and Superman are held in krypton.
Jordon, is there an album or anything in particular that is close to you in specifically the Peter Gabriel era? Or have you ever attempted to... You've done an amazing version of Misunderstanding by Genesis, but have you ever attempted anything from the Peter Gabriel era?
I sure have. Yeah, I have. I recorded a cover of Cuckoo Cocoon years ago, and I had it on 8-track, half-inch reel, half-inch tape. And unfortunately, the barn here burnt last year, so I lost all my old archives and stuff.
Oh, no.
Physical tape and stuff like that. But man, I should redo it. Also, my other band, Sheloom, with my pal Filippo Gaetani, we did a cover of Lily White Lilith last year, just as like a standalone single, just for fun, because we both love that album so much.
Chamber was in confusion. All the voices shouting loud. I can only just hear a voice quite near say, "Help me through the crowd." Said if I helped her through, she could help me too. But I could see that she was wholly blind from her pale face and her pale skin. Her moonlight shine, little white lily. She gonna take you to the top of night.
So for me, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is not only my favorite of the Peter Gabriel era, but it's my favorite Genesis album. Such a massive leap forward. And I mean, to think what kind of could have happened after that, even if they had exhausted themselves in super long format sort of pieces, it still would have been absolutely fascinating to hear Peter continue with them, because they seem to be, I mean, that record for me is just such a amazing statement. I mean, I just adore it. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, but I love all of the things leading up to it. And I was just listening to them sort of all in chronological order. And I mean, you can really kind of hear the confidence building. And by the time they get to Lamb, they just sort of are existing in their own universe and completely comfortable in their, you know, in what they had become. And when I'm looking at the chronology of it, and it's so incredibly fast, it's like the Beatles, where, you know, you have Nursery Crime in 71 and the Lamb in 74. That's 36 months, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And you have Foxtrot, the live album, Selling England by the Pound, which is a whole podcast in and of itself.
Yeah.
Incredible album. So yeah, I mean, my heart is in this band, you know. I love, and don't, you know, and of course Phil is a whole other 20 podcasts.
Oh yeah. No.
Well, I gotta ask Jordon, you know, when you listen to those early albums, especially in chronological order, and being a musician, and when you hear these compositions that they're writing, like Firth of Fifth and you know, Supper's Ready, and they're only 20, 21, 22, 23.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even like. I feel like my life was such a waste at that time. You know? I mean, these guys were writing.
I have puzzled over this. I mean, because Robert Plant was 21 when he sang and wrote the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven. And you think, man, most of us, or most of my peers, were certainly only getting started. And I've often puzzled about it. And I wonder, you know, of course it's a confluence of reasons, but you know, that particular generation, they kind of grew up fast. They were in the pubs when they were 16 years old playing music, and, you know, for years before anything kind of happened. And so 2 or 3 years go by and they're still only 17 or 18 years old, and they've cut their teeth in these clubs or in studios, you know, as it, you know, for guys like Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones. But certainly, yeah, like if you were of that age and you were in close proximity to, in this case, London, where so much stuff was going on, and you had an aptitude for music, I mean, things could happen for you back then. There was just, and then there's the phenomenon of American FM radio taking off at the same time. So these bands that were sort of, you know, had, you know, Genesis had, I guess, more of a European audience, and I would imagine King Crimson and Gentle Giant were the same. Now had somewhere to play their music with a large, pretty stoned early 70s audience, college age audience that were thirsting for this kind of entertainment. And so there was money to be made. And so these kids were allowed to just, you know, the audiences kept getting bigger. The sales, you know, I know Tony Smith, he was really the first guy that, you know, he was like, I'm committed to you guys for albums. You know, we don't have to worry about hits. Let's develop an audience. Let's get out on tour. There's a 100 other ways to build a band than just worrying about.
Yeah, he was really forward thinking, sure.
Yeah, and then they were aware of, you know, what was happening with FM radio in America, and you know, the world was theirs at that time.
And I think something that's criminally overlooked too was the education systems back then. Even in the schools, you know, where the poor schools, they're being taught the classics, they're being taught Shakespearean sonnets, and they're being taught Greek mythology and Western history and things like that, and had to be extremely influential on their writing.
Oh yeah.
And you can hear, you know, at age 20, 21, it's starting to regurgitate all these things that they've
they're coming up with their own versions of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, you're right. It really was a place and time for that generation of bands, and it's amazing to look back on it.
Yeah, and really I'm gonna interject here because Scott, you might notice Jordon actually did start writing pretty early and working with some pretty amazing folks when you were in your early to mid 20s, Jordon. I'm gonna kind of interject that for anybody who doesn't know, because you've helped write Celebrity Skin with Courtney Love. You've worked with Chris Cornell and some other amazing folks in your own right. So I think anybody listening to this should probably check out some of your early stuff, because you were in your early to mid 20s and you've written some incredible stuff around that time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was talking more about myself.
So we've talked about some of these amazing albums, and it's like Jordon, like you said, we could do an entire podcast on every single album. So I hate kind of glossing over this album, but I don't want to get bogged down. And then Scott, I do want to compliment you on your article, because you give a lot of detail, but I don't feel like I'm bogged down reading it. It's not like reading Moby Dick, where you're reading something cool happens, and then you're reading 75 pages of fucking whale teeth and what how the baleen is different in a blue whale from a right whale.
Right.
I don't give a shit. So you do a great job of giving him, going into great detail, but not getting in the weeds. So I want to compliment you on that. So, but
thank you.
So unfortunately, we do kind of have to move on to Peter Gabriel leaving. So his solo albums were not quite like the albums Genesis had started making. They weren't these enormous productions. I mean, he had some great people, but famously, he was working with Fairlight synthesizers and not allowing his drummers to use cymbals. It's not like he was paring things down. Was that a direct?
Not right away. Like the first one or two Peter Gabriel solo, certainly the first one kind of sounds, I think Bob Ezrin produced it. So it kind of has like a reverby kind of its time sound. It's like later when you get to the third album that he's getting really stark with his production.
Okay.
And angular, and the no cymbals, and giving it more, this sort of like very tribal drumming and lack of rock and roll cliches. Because when you're a drummer, you rely on cymbals to sort of artificially create excitement, to demarcate, arrangement spots. But when you don't have that, then what do you got? Well, you've got a lot of space, which he was using sort of like silence in a lot of that. If you listen to Intruder and stuff, there's little moments of like split seconds of silence almost where the instruments just kind of hang there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of tension in the music that he wanted to explore that, I think was a unique vision to him, that he kind of needed to not be in a collective in order to achieve that.
Yeah.
And then
because there's too many rules for a band. It's still like, if
there's no Tony Banks
comes in and imposes all these rules on a band, there's going to be resentment and it's not going to work. But as a solo artist, you can do that.
So, all right. So we had a technical issue, and fortunately I edited that all out to spare everyone's ears. So we're in 1970. Peter Gabriel has left. But one thing I thought was interesting was that Gabriel left, and then Hackett did his very first solo album, Voyage of the Acolyte. Phil is drumming with Brand X. I mean, is this just stuff that they're doing on the side while they're trying to get a new singer, or was there genuine fear that the band was done?
Well, I think Phil had started with Brand X. It's just kind of a thing to do when there was downtime. Okay. I think it started as a band that they were kind of jazzy. I have their stuff. It's interesting. There's a song they did called And So to F that Phil would eventually incorporate into his live repertoire, when he was touring after In the Air Tonight. And Steve, it was more frustration because his songs just weren't getting on the albums. And Voyage of the Acolyte was just an outlet for him to just be creative and write more songs. And it's interesting. It's almost like an unofficial Genesis album, because everybody except for Peter Gabriel, who, Peter was he was persona non grata for a couple of years with those guys.
Yeah.
Phil was the only one, because Phil's just naturally gregarious, and he's everybody's friend. And Tony Banks, everybody's helped each other out on a solo album, except nobody's ever asked Tony to participate.
Yeah.
He is Genesis. Tony Banks is Genesis.
He is. I mean, he is Genesis. That's his group. And I think he's a difficult guy,
Right.
to work with, and they just don't want to deal with it. Like, it's just like we've all got that one guy. Like, listen, I like working with him when we're doing this. I just don't want him around any other time.
Yeah.
And I think Tony is that guy. So Mike was on it, Phil was on it, and so it's like 2/3 of 3/4 of Genesis were on that album, and it sounds very Genesis-y. That's the thing about all their solo albums. All their solo albums have an element of Genesis to it. You can almost their part, but their part almost sounds like the other parts, but not completely. It's interesting. And then Steve, he bartered. He really asked for more songs, more features on the album, more co-writing credits, because they went from like, we're all credited on every song, to after Peter Gabriel left, it's like, okay, well, we're going to credit individually. Phil wrote this song, Tony and Mike wrote this song, Steve wrote this song, so I think, that eventually weighed on Steve, and he in 1977 was when he just decided, I'm done.
So as the band's going, it seems to be getting less prog. I mean, they're still keeping prog elements, but it seems like they're going back to pop almost, especially with Phil taking center stage, and with his solo stuff. Sometimes for me, it's, especially when I was a lot younger, it was very hard to distinguish what was a Phil Collins solo song and what was a Genesis song from the, especially the late 70s to early 80s. I just found it kind of weird. They kind of went back into a circle, went from going pop to prog. Then as the band got smaller, their presence in radio got much bigger.
Yeah, well, I attribute that to just understanding the musical landscape at the time. Prog was just something that could only go so far. I think it collapsed under its own weight. I think it captured a moment in time. Prog was done best by the Brits, because it's almost like the English countryside set to music. It's
and the whimsy, English whimsy, and
we've heard it. It was pastoral. It's ethereal. It really caught that post Woodstock, post Beatles hippie era from the late 1960s. And that carried on to the early to mid 70s. It was really kind of an embodiment of all that stuff. And then along comes, the Sex Pistols and the punk rock movement. And, they were very anti-jam, anti-long song. They were kind of back to basics, and there was like no coexistence. It's not, like, I'm a kind of guy where I can listen to The Clash, and I can listen to Genesis. I can listen. I can listen to the Grateful Dead, and I can listen to I don't know, the Knack. I'm trying to think of a punk rock band from the U.S. from the 70s. They really couldn't coexist, and there was really kind of an anti-prog movement there in the mid to late 70s, and it just kind of came naturally. It really started once they got down to 3. The appropriately titled "And Then There Were 3" album. That's when they wrote "Follow You, Follow Me," which was their very first pop success. And their audiences started getting bigger, and females started showing up. And they're getting invited to play on the BBC again. And
"Follow You, Follow Me" was my wife asked to play that at our wedding. So
Every day is such a perfect day to spend alone with you. I will follow you. Will you follow me? All the days and nights that we know will be. I will stay with you. Will you stay with me? Just one single tear in each passing year.
Right. So Yeah, and so it just lent itself, and that gives way to Duke, and that gives way to Abacab, and then Genesis, and then MTV and radio, and you got a whole new Genesis, but
a bit of a sillier Genesis too.
But there's always that element that it's almost like Fleetwood Mac. There's always like this mysticism, no matter who was in the band, this mystical quality, especially with the guitar, and that same rhythm section of John McVie and Mick Fleetwood, and then but you still have that same, you still got Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford there and Phil's drumming to just give it that sound, that quality that just always kind of carries through. It almost seemed on every album there was a nod to their past. Even
Invisible Touch. Even
right.
At the height of pop, there was, what was that song? The Brazilian and Domino. They were, Brazilian,
right.
Yeah.
And then on Genesis, you got Home by the Sea, and Second Home by the Sea. Yep. So they never really let that completely go.
Mm-hmm.
This is the era of Genesis that I remember the most, that got me into Genesis, and then going back, and much like Jordon, we would go to our cousin's house, and our cousins were a couple of years older than us, and they had Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and a couple other earlier Genesis cassettes, and I remember putting those on and be like, who the hell is singing this? This doesn't sound anything like Mama. So I was like, "This, what is?" So I have an affinity or a what's the word I'm looking for? I guess a predilection towards 80s Phil Collins Genesis, because it was my introduction, and it was all over the place. And as I mentioned earlier, Jordon, you did a really cool version of Misunderstanding. What songs from the Phil era are your top songs? I mean, obviously I'm shooting for Jordon, Misunderstanding, but what, and have you tried covering anything else besides that song?
No, but I always wanted to. I think my favorite one is Keep It Dark, song 4 off of Abacab.
Yes.
Great.
I always wanted to do that. I think Phil's son did a cover of it, but it was pretty faithful to the original, if I remember. But I mean, that song is so cool. There's a couple different sections, but I wouldn't necessarily call it prog. It's all in 4/4. But the soundscapes and the change and there's like these big sort of sonic scene changes and an aggressive use of percussion. Like the drums are very loud and become sort of the lead instrument in the band at that point.
And that reverb they put on his voice is so. It becomes like this signature Phil Collins sound that they use in the 80s for his voice. And curiously, though, like this is an interesting thing about their process. As the three of them became sort of like the solid lineup again, all of a sudden, okay, well, this is now the stable lineup with Phil, 3 of us. By the self-titled album, they'd gotten back into group composition, and there's a cool video on YouTube. It's basically just like home movies of them recording that album. And you can kind of see the process of them writing and they're kind of writing as a group again, but in a different way. It's sort of less, they're jamming, but very much consciously constructing the songs at the same time and trying these sort of like experimental sort of ensemble playing experiments to sort of like write the next section, which is kind of curious little tweak in their process later on.
If I could pick one song for you to cover, it would be Dodo Lurker.
Yeah, I love that one too. That's my kid Sydney's favorite song by them. He used to
nice.
love that tune. The Yeah.
Meanwhile, lurking by a stone in the mud, two eyes looked to see what I was, and then something spoke, and this is what it said to me.
Again, it's totally kooky, and like you were saying, there's sort of a more lighthearted nature to Phil being the front man of the band. Certainly, as he becomes more confident, and humor starts to interject, much like Rush, who started out as sort of po-faced, these Ayn Rand sort of serious dudes, and by the time you get to 80, 81, they're doing cameos on the Mackenzie brothers.
Yes,
and
Take Off.
Both of them. I think both Genesis and Rush were very influenced by maybe not so much punk, but new wave. Certainly the Police.
Yeah,
and what could be done in a modern context with the brevity of a short pop song, utilizing new early 80s production techniques and playing not as sort of slow and lugubrious, like having more up tempo, like faster tempos and stuff, which Genesis and Rush were doing. So that's really fascinating to me is when the prog bands, because it was a process. They didn't just wake up one day and become, the Rush of Time Stands Still or the Genesis of Invisible Touch. They didn't just wake up like that.
Right.
There was a process, and Abacab to me is like the big sort of, it's a masterpiece to me, but it's also the gateway to pure pop, but they're not quite there yet. They're still really, really kind of pushing things on a production level that I think is really innovative and cool on Abacab.
And they're not resting. They put out 6 albums in 10 years.
Yeah, they're putting out music at a phenomenal rate.
Yeah,
it's amazing. And the thing that kind of kept them fresh in the 80s is that none of them were, they weren't like a band with drug problems and stuff like that. So,
right.
They had a great work ethic, and they loved being in Genesis. Like, it was fun. Like, why wouldn't you want to be in Genesis?
Oh yeah.
They took the work seriously, and over time took themselves less seriously.
Yeah, I think Mike Rutherford always told a story like when they did their first or second American tour in like 73, the record label, I think the American distributor, which was Atlantic, I think even then, had a private detective follow them to see, if they get into any kind of trouble, make sure to get ahead of it before the police get there. And like after like a week or a few days, the PI is like, can I go do something else? These guys are so incredibly boring. So they didn't do anything. I think Peter Gabriel might have had a coke addiction in the 80s for a little while, but
who didn't?
That was
who didn't? Yeah.
So, but yeah, I'm with Jordon on Keep It Dark. That's probably there's a lot of, I haven't met too many people, but there are people that, be like, I just don't like the way they sold out and became poppy in the 80s. And I think, I always say, have you ever heard Keep It Dark?
Yeah.
That's about it's not like old Genesis, but it's definitely a great song, in any genre.
Amazing.
Yeah, and like you guys both mentioned, in every album, there's something that's that's maybe like a callback to some of their older stuff.
Just a remembrance of what they started off as.
Yeah, even on Invisible Touch, like you said, the Brazilian, but also the extended version of Tonight. It's 8 minutes long. And that's one of my favorite Genesis songs.
And there's one on We Can't Dance too. On the We Can't Dance album, it's a statement. There's a song too on that. That's like it's
absolutely
instrumental.
So there's a big gap between Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance, and I know Phil was doing solo stuff and all. Scott, you like you said, you do a lot of research on this stuff, and Jordon, you're a huge fan. Do you guys know? Was it just a hiatus, or was it the band was in fear of breaking up, or what was it?
Did they not do a massive tour for Invisible Touch?
They did.
Yeah, but I think that ended in
Yeah.
'86, and then another 5 years.
Well, that tour might have gone on for a year and a half, probably.
Yeah.
I think it's probably
There's
go
no
ahead.
Phil solo album until like '89, I think.
Okay.
Well, that's the thing too. It's like they got they record and tour for Genesis, and then Genesis takes a break, and then Phil does his recording and touring, and that cycle repeats itself for several times. It's no wonder Phil looks the way he does today. I mean, that's just warmed out. But I think it's like I've seen interviews with Bruce Springsteen about the Born in the USA tour. I've seen interviews with Hall & Oates about Hall & Oates had that incredible run from like Voices to H2O to Big Bam Boom, where they were like on tour from like 1980 to like 1986.
Yeah.
And it just wore them out.
I know we did have another technical issue, so we're back again, and so we're talking about the tour cycle and how that could have been the reason for the gap between Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance. And then we get to the final studio album, which I'll be honest with you, I was going to listen to on the ride home tonight, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. And I imagine a lot of people felt that way. The last album with Ray Wilson, right? Calling All Stations?
Yeah, right.
So,
which is to date, I think the last Genesis studio album proper.
Yeah,
is that correct?
It is.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think
What a way to end it, lads.
From Genesis to Revelation may have more fans than Calling All Stations. So,
and it's and it's really not fair. It's not. It's not a bad album.
Not at all.
yeah.
It sounds like Genesis. It's got Tony and Mike, and it's funny because like as you listen to Ray, he starts to sound like himself, but near the end, he starts to sound more and more like Peter Gabriel. I don't know if you have ever heard any of the B-sides.
Oh no.
There's some really good stuff on there, and he sounds like Peter Gabriel. I mean,
Really?
I don't know if it's deliberate. Yeah, it's interesting. And he was with a group called Stillskin before that was
which sounds
pretty
vaguely
positive.
sexual, to be honest.
I just think of Rumpelstiltskin.
I don't know why my brain goes like Rumple Foreskin.
Yeah, I don't know. But no, but it's not bad. Listen, I'm not going to say it's the greatest Genesis album out there. You just drop everything and go listen to it. But if you got a Genesis shuffle and going on and that's in there, you're not going to be disappointed.
One of the things that I discovered, because I've read a little bit about it, even though I didn't listen to it, they auditioned a guy that I've been trying to get on the podcast, reaching out to, but a guy that I listened to a lot in the early 90s, Francis Dunnery, who played guitar for Robert Plant and had done a bunch of solo albums. He auditioned to be the singer for Genesis. I thought that was really wild.
Yeah, I had heard that before too, and I think he's got some funny Tony Banks story or something too that like auditioning for him. We're gonna do this, just very straight and to the point. I think it would have been better if they had if maybe Mike. It's kind of like this. My favorite show is The Rockford Files. It's my favorite show of all time. Mark knows this.
Yes,
and they just announced that they're doing a reboot with some blockhead actor who's just been in everything. I forget his name. His name's escaped. He was in The Angel. My wife used to watch it before we met.
It's not David Boreanaz, is it?
Yeah, David Boreanaz. And I'm like, you know what? No. Why don't you?
He's got the hair.
And I'm like, why don't you just do a show like Rockford with David Boreanaz and just call it something else?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like what I thought with this final Genesis album. Why don't you just do something with Ray and just call it something else? It just seems too much like a cash grab at that point to me. Which I'm okay with people making money. If everybody said, "Hey, Scott, I got this. We're gonna pay you a ton of money to write this book." Okay, I'll do it. So I'm not getting for that, but I think if you want it to be a success or even a critical success or an artistic success, I think that's the best way to go about it, rather than do it, because I think it's insulting to the fans, and the fans aren't going to embrace it. The fans don't want a third Genesis lead singer. It's either got to be Peter or it's got to be Phil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too late.
Yeah. It's not going to be now. It's not going to be Phil. They could. But it's like the thought of them reuniting with Peter Gabriel is just like it gives them chills to even think about it. Like that form of Genesis is extinct. It's there's a great tribute band out there called the Musical Box. Mark and I have seen them.
Yeah.
Jordan, if you ever get a chance, man, I highly recommend. They recreate mostly Peter Gabriel. They do some early Phil eras too, but they recreate the tours. They did the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour. They're sanctioned by they got Genesis's approval. They got Peter Gabriel's approval. I think because there's no footage of a complete Lamb Lies Down on Broadway show. I think they were able to consult with Tony and Mike and get all the elements. They used some of the original film that was used.
Yeah,
the guy sounds like Peter Gabriel. They knock it out of the park.
They recreate all the costumes. It's unreal.
Yeah, it's like $25-$30 a ticket, and it's like one of the greatest things you're ever going to see. So, and it's nice because that gave, like I said, that era of Genesis is extinct. It's never going to come back. They're scared to death to even think about it. The only time it happened was in 1982 when I think Peter Gabriel owed money to the mob. Because of his loan. He had like a disaster with the WOMAD thing, and they're like threatening to break his legs, or something. And so he's like, "Well, what's the best way to recoup this?" Genesis reunion. So they did it, and he was able. And the guys came and helped him out, and even Steve Hackett showed up. But that was 1982. That was I was 6 years old. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen again. And Phil's not coming back either. So I think Genesis, like the Peter Gabriel era, is now completely extinct, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it's going to happen to everybody.
Oh, yeah. So last couple of questions before we wrap this up. And I will ask them at the same time, and you can answer however you want. And I'll start with Jordon here. Do you have a favorite era of Genesis? Do you prefer the Peter Gabriel version over the Phil Collins version, or the Ray Wilson version over the Peter Gabriel version or era? And do you have a favorite Genesis cover done by someone other than yourself? And Scott, I'm gonna, same question to you, but Jordon, do you have any thoughts on your favorite era of Genesis?
Era, it's a difficult one because my favorite album is The Lamb, but I would say, like, era wise, I really like, Abacab, Duke, into the 80s. I absolutely adore Genesis, but I would say, just as a musician, I'm probably most influenced by like Abacab-ish.
Okay.
That sort of stuff has really sort of sunk into my sort of DNA the most.
Okay. And have you heard? I don't hear a whole lot of Genesis covers.
No, I was just gonna say, I'm trying to think of one that's
the only ones I can think of are Your Misunderstanding, and Jeff Buckley does Back in New York City. Well, he's dead. So
right, yeah.
Those are the only two that I can really think of. Scott, are you aware of any other Genesis covers?
They weren't really a band that people covered a lot, which is interesting, but they're also of an era where, people didn't cover too much, and we look in the 80s, that kind of came, maybe into the 90s. I think there's more, like when you got like Third Eye Blind doing a B-side cover of The Air That I Breathe, or Foo Fighters doing Baker Street,
Yeah.
But Steve Hackett was in like this super group with Steve Howe called GTR.
Yeah.
And they did a live version of I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, which I think is phenomenal. I think Steve Howe.
I just thought of someone who covered a Genesis song.
Who's that?
Phil Collins covered Behind the Lights.
True.
That's fair.
He did a better job with it.
He sure did. I love it.
That's fair. All right. So I'm looking it up right now. So there's some heavy Genesis covers. So band called Dark Empire did The Knife.
Someone did Land of Confusion about 15 years ago. I remember hearing
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I remember that too.
somebody did Firth of Fifth. Rob J. Madden. I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is.
They're kind of a hard group to cover, especially those era. Those songs are long.
Yeah. Disturbed did Land of Confusion.
That was it.
Yeah, I think they had a hit with it.
I remember hearing it on the radio a few times for sure.
And the band Ghost did Jesus He Knows Me.
What?
Okay.
Apparently,
That's from We Can't Dance, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I'll get you everything you want. I'll get you everything you need. You don't need to believe in hereafter. Just believe in me. 'Cause Jesus, he knows me, and he knows I'm right. I've been talking to Jesus all my life. Oh, yes, he knows me, and he knows I'm right. And he's been telling me everything is alright. I believe in
Funny one.
So
Another good video.
I'd have to check that out. Maybe. I don't know. So, Scott, do you have
What I love though? I got to say one thing. I bought the Blu-ray of the Three Sides Live DVD like concert film.
Yeah.
That's fun to watch.
Oh, wow.
That's
Oh,
really cool.
I didn't even know that existed. I'll have to get that. That's
Oh,
I
do
love
indeed.
watching.
Yeah, there's lots of interview footage where they'll be in a town and it'll show like Phil going to the radio station in the morning and he's completely at ease and charming and funny and just amazing. Like the way that they handle the promotion aspect of it with just such sort of ease and nonchalance. And it's fun to see because at that point the band is bringing their wives and newly born children on the road.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
So it's like 1981 and they're driving across America in this bus and there's like little kids and it's very
That's
domestic.
neat. I'll have to watch it. Yeah. I'll
It's
check
super
that out.
cool.
That's awesome. All right.
Yeah.
So, Scott, do you have a favorite era of Genesis?
Well, I mean, yes, yeah, I do. Critically, I would say the Peter Gabriel era is the best from a critical standpoint. But from a sentimental, having grown up in the 80s, I love like Jordon, the Abacab, Genesis, Invisible Touch era,
Yeah.
coupled with the Phil Collins and Mike and the Mechanics. I was never like a huge fan of. I like them though.
Yeah.
But I love for any of like I like Peter and Phil's solo stuff the best. So just growing up in that whirlwind, it greatly appeals to me, and it brings it nicely together. I can listen. I have a great big Genesis playlist in my iTunes, and I can just put it on shuffle. And it could go from Firth of Fifth to I Can't Dance, and I'll be happy.
Yeah. Well, guys, this has been a blast. I mean, outside of a couple technical difficulties, we did manage to cover everything in about an hour and 20 minutes, so we're doing all right. But Scott, you've got by the time this airs, both articles will be out. Where can people find the articles? Where can they follow you? You've written a book on the Mamas and the Papas. You're working on more stuff. Tell us where we can follow you and what you're up to.
You can go to my website. It's scottsheaauthor.com. Shea spelled S-H-E-A. Anybody out there who doesn't know, it's got links to all my socials. It's got links to where you can buy my biography of the Mamas and the Papas. And Jordon, if you're a fan of the music industry and the music sounds from the 50s to the early 70s, I think you really enjoy that book because it really talks about not only their story, but it also talks about the music industry and the business and everything from during that era and all the different changes that were going on. All links to all my articles are on there, some interviews, and working on a Waylon Jennings book that's going to be coming out probably next year. So excited about all that.
Excellent. All right. And Jordon, what are you working on these days?
I'm working on, most of my days are spent mixing these days in the studio, but I'm also a little over halfway finished the next Blinker the Star record.
Nice.
So, yeah, that's what's happening. Oh, and I just wanted to say that, speaking of Mamas and Papas, I used to live in Denny Doherty's guest house.
Did Michelle Phillips try to sue you too?
No, but I wrote a song with Bijou.
Nice.
I did. I actually
Nice.
did, yeah.
Well, if you took
Tying it all
I'll give it my
together.
best.
And you did a fun little cameo on the Failure documentary, We Are Hallucinations. I did
Oh,
see
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Yep.
So a little plug for them. They're coming out with their new album's coming out soon. I just found that out the other day. So we're getting Failure in on this one too somehow. They weasel their way into a lot of my
the Mamas and
podcasts.
the Papas and Failure.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for spending a good chunk of your evening with me and talking about the band we all love, Genesis. It's been a blast. I learned a lot from reading your article, Scott, and Jordon. I always love your perspective on anything that we talk about. That's why I love having you on the podcast. So thank you guys so much. Jordon, where can people follow you? Because I forgot to ask you that earlier.
Any of the normal socials like Instagram, and but Bandcamp is where you can actually purchase stuff, which helps out a lot. So
Awesome.
link at the start, Bandcamp.
Perfect. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you again, and I will talk to you guys real soon.
Will do.
Cheers, friends. That was a pleasure. That was fun.
Thanks, Jordan.
Awesome. We'll talk to y'all soon.